Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here on the Providence College Podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. This week, we're talking with Dr. Robin Greene, Associate Professor of History and Classics, and this year's winner of the Joseph R. Accinno Award, the college's highest teaching honor. She teaches in the Development of Western Civilization program, now in its 50th year, as well as courses in ancient history, literature, mythology, Latin, and Greek. On Wednesday, Greene presented the keynote address at Academic Convocation, an event welcoming new students and faculty to the community at the start of the school year. Dr. Greene, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, during your talk, you told some very relatable anecdotes about getting acclimated to college, including listing off your grades for that first semester. So we have to ask, how did you turn things around? And what led you to study classics?
First of all, I've learned already not to list my grades ever again. My Civ teammates keep telling all the students, no matter how bad you do, you can't do as bad as Greene did. So, but turning it around, I just kept trying new things. I didn't, all my papers were terrible because I kept repeating what my professor said, and I thought that meant I was thinking. So I did go to some of them, and, what's wrong with me? And they said, well, you're not saying anything new. And that was really terrifying. I don't think we're used to having to say our own thoughts in a new way. So my second semester, I did much better. Still not great, but I just kept trying new approaches to every assignment and figuring out, this is what they want. Because sometimes it's hard for us to tell you what we want for students. It's like a student will be like, what's wrong with this? I'm like, it's not good. And sometimes it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint exactly the approach a certain student should take. So I forget your other question already. I'm sorry.
Well, I think the glass half full approach to your colleagues' commentary on your grades is that, look, you can redeem yourself after having a lousy first year semester.
Absolutely. I mean, if your life is over after one semester, I'd still be at Denny's. And I would not be here as a professor. So it's absolutely possible. You just have to take the time to figure out what do I need to do to get what I want.
Precisely. So what brought you from that first semester to a career in classics?
See, at the University of Kansas, where I went, we had a language requirement. And everybody, no matter what your major was, had to take 2 years of a language. And I'm really, really bad at conversational languages. At least I was back then. I've gotten better. But I knew whatever I did not want to have to actually speak the language. And so that left Latin or Greek for me to take, just to fulfill that. And Latin was really early in the morning. So I took Greek. And I ended up really just liking it. And I discovered I was good at it. And my mind sort of worked along with that really well. I originally thought I was going to be in the sciences, but I'm terrible at math. So I discovered, I'm bad at math, but I'm good at Greek. And that's how I ended up doing it.
So kind of the prerequisites of the scheduling system. If Latin had been in the afternoon and Greek had been in the morning, could have all been different.
Absolutely, absolutely. I loved my Greek teacher. I wanted to take more classes with her, and that turned into a major.
So you teach Development of Western Civilization, otherwise known as Civ. And during your talk, you shared some of your expertise in Latin with your students and faculty colleagues there. I'm sure today you get challenged by people who ask about the value and relevance of learning the classics and an education in classics. How do you respond to them?
There's a lot of different ways to do that. One of the ways that I think is truest is that learning another language, especially a dead language, requires you to really understand it, to think about a culture more holistically than we're used to. We can't go ask an ancient Greek person what they really mean by something. And so to understand a text or understand a language, you have to look at the history, look at the religion, look at the culture, look at the art from a lot of different perspectives to put it together. And those skills that sort of I think of it kind of like CSI, where you have to look at all the little details to get a composite picture of what actually happened. Those skills translate really well into a lot of different careers. I've got students who go on to become academics, but I have students, a lot of them who are lawyers. Actually, classics earns the highest LSAT grade in the country for more than a decade now, I believe, because we train you to look at all those little details to put together a case. So a lot of analytic fields. We've been really successful with finance. which really sort of shocked me. But there's a lot of financial firms that wants people to have these sort of hunting skills that we really have people do. So I've had several classics and finance double majors, which was a huge surprise to me. But so there's all sorts of careers that the skills we're teaching are excellent. And the last one, if I wasn't going to be a professor, I was going to work for the Foreign Service. Because once you prove you can learn a language like Greek, they think they can teach you any language. And you go be a diplomat.
So you also discussed the value of a civ education in your talk. Well, what are some examples of things that might impact us now that people might not realize have those influences from the past?
Oh, geez, almost everything, really. For example, let me think of a couple good ones here. Well, certainly when the way we talk about factioning, political factioning today, that's unfortunately a really big hot button issue in the States right now. But the history of political factioning, particularly within sort of globalized empires, this is, fundamental to understanding what the Athenians were doing, what happened to ancient Rome, what happened to Europe at several different points in the Middle Ages. And so I think that students sort of looking at the way that factioning worked early on, it divorces itself a little bit from all the high emotions we have now. Like nobody identifies personally with the noblemen versus the popular politicians in Rome. Like they're not, oh no, I hate those guys. They're kind of neutral. And so it lets us explore the same mechanisms that are playing out today in a little more of a neutral ground. And so then when they apply it to their own world, I think they see perspectives that they would not have seen otherwise.
The Accinno Award is presented annually to the faculty member who best exhibits excellence in teaching, passion and enthusiasm for learning, and genuine concern for students' academic and personal growth. Could you tell us a little about your approach to teaching and what motivates you?
I feel like I should have some sort of well thought out plan or science of teaching. But really what I do is I want to be the teacher that I wanted to have had. There's things about my subject that are just fascinating and interesting, and in the hands of a bad teacher, they lose all of that. And I don't want them to. I feel like I owe the things I'm teaching more than to be bored by them, even though I do it every year. So sometimes with Civ, 10th year of Civ, let's do Plato again. But they're intrinsically fascinating, and I want to do them justice. So for me, in terms of teaching, my ultimate goal is to do them justice. Not every student is going to fall in love with Homer, but I want to try. And so every year I do different experimental things, just trying to see what works and what doesn't. And last year, I had this whole new approach to 102 I was using all these little tiny sources that we could really dig into, and I thought it was going to be awesome. And I was really excited to get them into that, and they hated it. They just killed me on reviews. But I think, again, I want to be the teacher that does these things justice. And so I think the other important component is listening to students. Sometimes we have to make them do things they don't want to do, and they're important to do. But when everybody hates something, that tells me, I have to be able to adapt and to change and to try new things, but recognize that's a big failure. And I think we often don't want to do that. We want everything to not be a failure. And so we're like, oh no, the students just didn't like it. But no, it failed. So.
Well, speaking of Plato, could you tell us about some of those assignments that you mentioned in your reflection for the Accinno Award?
Well, yeah, I'll use the Plato example. Students grow up hearing a lot of these names. Plato, Homer, they come invested with a certain weight. And students, I think, are really kind of afraid to criticize these names. You can't say anything bad about Plato. You can't say anything is off in the way the New Testament is constructed. That's wrong. We can't. Who are we to do that? Seems to be the prevailing attitude. So I try to construct assignments that require students to criticize. Not, they're horrible, but to actually really think in a critical way about what these authors are saying. Because, yes, Plato is the philosopher, but he wasn't the last philosopher. And that means that a lot of people after him found something to find fault with. And so I have like assignments where I try to teach students about logical fallacies, poor argumentation. That's often something we find in Civ 101 papers, is they don't really know what fallacies are, and so they fall into them quickly. So to teach them that, I actually make them go hunting through Plato for his logical fallacies. Like, where is his argument crappy? And so that way I'm trying to sort of do two things at once, get them to learn about fallacies, but also have them build confidence in realizing that they're allowed to criticize these big names of Western Civ.
Could you tell us about your translation exercise?
Oh, I forget which one I wrote about. One of them, I think my favorite is the biblical one. That's the one you're referring to. Yeah, see, I think a lot of students don't really think about the language difference between what they're reading in Civ and what was originally written on the page. And whenever you translate, you do come at it from a certain bias. You're thinking, what language do I need to speak to my contemporary readers to get them to understand this? But every language choice has within it, sort of hidden meanings. And so what I have them do sometimes with the Bible is I have them pick a certain passage, usually one that's important. I think my favorite is to use the punishment or the consequences of Eve's actions in Genesis 3. And I have them look at multiple translations from multiple time periods. So things like the King James Bible versus the New American Bible versus Hebrew translations aimed at a Jewish audience. And the differences are amazing. And given that, we do continue to base a lot of our moral and legal standpoints from the Bible, it's not just, God's word. It's some guy from the 16th century who's also infecting contemporary American policies with his point of view. And I really want students to understand that.
Because there's no way that students in the first 2 years at PC, most students would not be reading the primary text.
No. And so like when they're reading Homer, when they're reading Virgil, when they're reading anything, up until really 201, when you start getting modern English, a little bit 102 with Shakespeare. But all of it has been through several hands that all have their own perspectives. And I think that students need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. I imagine things were a little different during the pandemic. Sort of the question we ask every faculty member, how were you able to adapt some of your teaching for that period?
I'm still kind of shocked I won the award for the pandemic year because it was so hard and so sort of terrible in many ways. Because I really rely in class on a lot of close discussion. I could do a lot of it. It wasn't like I work in a lab where we couldn't access materials. So I could do everything I needed to do. But that forging of connection between myself and the participants and each other was a lot more difficult. So I really experimented a lot. I don't think I came up with a good decision. I think I need another year of the pandemic to maybe do that. Fingers crossed, that's not going to happen. But I tried to do a lot of group work. I tried to do a lot of in and out of class work. I tried to do things with like going to museums virtually. And so I feel like I tried. I don't feel like I succeeded. I don't know if anybody does. I think all of us are pretty sort of down on the whole experience.
I think anything that was done is a success, and we mark it as such.
And I think the students recognized that we were all trying. I think they knew that. So it was cooperative in helpful ways.
So when we talk about Civ, I think many people outside of PC might be surprised and learn that it's team taught and there's not some syllabus carved in stone that every team uses in their classes. So what are some of the texts that you go to, some of the more surprising texts that people would be surprised are a part of Civ?
Well, for my text, because I do the Greek and Latin stuff, most of it is pretty standard. There's Plato and Homer and all of these. What I do think is interesting is how little people know about the authors. And so I think that the surprise comes actually with some of the authors. For example, one I like to teach is a guy called Epictetus. And he was a Stoic, and their philosophy was, you can't control the world. All you can do is control your reactions to it, which is, sort of timely lately. But the thing about Epictetus, and he'll even say, if your family dies, just don't be sad. You're just giving it back to the universe. Don't be affected. And students are often like, ugh, that's horrible. How dare this? And they all expect Epictetus to be some sort of rich, white Roman nobleman. And he's a slave. And I often hold off saying, anything about his identity until they've gotten mad at him. Who is this guy to tell us? He doesn't understand pain and stuff. He was a slave, and he was also afflicted with lifelong disease that left him often unable to move and in terrible pain. So if any guy could have sort of the pedigree to talk about, life sucks, but just deal with it, it's this guy. And so I think a lot of the other authors that we do in Civ, you know their name, but a lot of people don't know their backgrounds. Another surprising one is De las Casas. He's somebody I do in 102. He's a guy I'm surprised more people haven't heard of.
Bartholomew?
Yeah, Bartholomew de las Casas.
Could you give us the snapshot of Bartholomew for those readers who don't know? Because the Dominican.
Yeah, he's a Dominican, and he is a Dominican who is in the New World during the decades of Spanish colonization, and he is horrified by the way that the Spanish colonizers are treating the indigenous peoples. And he starts this letter writing campaign to the king, and he spends most of his life, he ends up writing a history, which my students read, but he spends most of his life campaigning for the rights, he doesn't quite use that language, but the rights of the indigenous peoples. And I don't think that many people outside PC, at least I'd never even heard of him before I came here. He's for some reason not typically taught, yet he's fundamental to the history of human rights. And so that's my favorite text to teach in 102, because I think students tend to believe that up until the Civil War, everybody thought slavery was cool, and the history is far more complex than that. And he's a great entrance to it. And he also makes us think about, well, how do we define the West? Because once, America opens up, where is the West on a map? And so I can get students thinking about that with him as well.
We've talked a lot about teaching. Let's turn to your research. What are you digging into right now?
I do two things. I work on my main period. It's called the Hellenistic period. It has nothing to do with hell. It just means the Greekifying period. But it's the time, the literature and the culture after Alexander the Great conquered pretty much the whole ancient world. Then he dies, and it gets divided up into these big sort of globalized empires. And my research is centered at the Egyptian one, where the Great Library of Alexandria was and where it was founded. So one stem of my research looks at the poetry of the period, and you can really see them trying to create a sort of new ethnic identity. Now that the old city-states, Athens, Sparta, are sort of gone, they're subsumed into this big empire, the Greeks are left wondering, well, who are we then? And so you can see the poets trying to create a new identity in this world that aligns with new values. No longer are people in control of their own government. It's not democracy anymore. We have an emperor. So what does that make us? So I work on that a lot. And the other thing I work on is probably something no one on campus has ever said. It's called paradoxography. It's something else that happened at the Great Library, but they gathered all the books together. And they were really interested in the broader world. The world got bigger after Alexander the Great. And so what paradoxographers did, they're sort of like armchair historians. They never went anywhere. But they would cull through all these new texts to find unexplained mysteries. It's sort of like the X-Files. I know it's a dated reference, but the X-Files of the ancient world. And so they'd make these books of examples of weird stuff that can't be explained. Like there's this lake in Persia that if you jump into it, and you're a man, your bits will fall off. And it's just weird little things. And so I wrote a book on one of the paradoxographers, sort of tracing what's going on with this weird sort of X-Files natural science. It's popular literature. It's stuff people read for fun. It's not the high stuff. It's not Homer. You're not going to go home after a hard day at work and be like, I'm going to read some Homer. If you're in ancient Greek, you're going to read something fun. So it sort of opens the door for popular literature in the ancient world.
It almost sounds like these are like the Wikipedia editors of their time.
Yes. Or like, I compared it in one of my articles, I compared it to, those cracked lists? Like 10 places in the world that want to kill you is the one but it's kind of like that. And they're about the same length too. You can just check it out, like, oh, that's interesting, and then go on with your day. And so it really, I think, speaks to sort of the modern. I think we all tend to think that they're sitting back at home, reading big long scrolls of tragedy. They're not doing that. They're reading fun stuff.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good time. I mean, I get paid to look at paradoxography. It's a good time.
Thank you for being the one to pronounce that.
No, it's just the word paradox plus ography at the end.
So during your talk, you told an anecdote about your path to college. A path did not take you directly from high school to college, but had a pit stop for 2 years at a Denny's.
Yes.
You mentioned learning some key life lessons during that time. Could you tell us some of them now?
Oh, I have to think of some that I can actually say on the radio. Because, I worked the third shift. That's 10 at night to 6 in the morning. So we were the drunk shift. You have all the bars let out at like 1 or 2. And the bar rush comes in. And then 3 hours later, the early church rush comes in. So there's always a really sort of big shift in one's expectations. But I think the one that's coming to my mind that I can tell, I think that, like many people, when I was younger, I sort of stratified wisdom. I thought, people like professors and rich people in New York City or something, they're wise and smart. And then people like, garbage men, they're not. I think we rely on these sort of easy stereotypes. And there was this group of truck drivers that came in every week. I can't remember any of their names. But they came in every week and they sat at the bar. And they drove all around the Midwest dropping off truck stuff. And they looked like truck drivers. But they would come in every week to talk about philosophy with each other. And they read it in the original language. So I remember the first time I saw them, they were reading Kant in German. And like talking about Kant in German. And I don't remember the discussion, but I remember being very impressed and thinking, this is how professors talk. And they would do that with other, it was mostly German, Italian, and French philosophy. I remember they did Nietzsche at one point. But they would sit there for 3 or 4 hours, starting at like 4 in the morning and going until we kicked them out because we needed the space. And just have these arguments with each other. And that opened up my eyes to just getting past the sort of childish view of the world that only certain types of people can find these things important and interesting. And they're one of the reasons I went back to college, because they kept telling me, oh, you're smart, because I would start discussing things with them. I started reading for the group, the truck driver group. I'm like, you should go to college, Greene. Oh my God, it's for lemmings.
I have this picture of, continuing these discussions on the ham radios, like on the CB using handles. And
I think they did. I think they talked about it a lot, but they actually orchestrated their schedules going all around the country just so they could meet every week at that time and talk to each other. And I loved that group of guys. They were terrible tippers, but
they gave you other tips.
They did. And I really am sad I can't remember their names, because I'd kind of like to search them out and see how they are in a way. But
you have to call the Dennys and see if it's still there.
Yeah, I should.
Dr. Greene, this year the college is celebrating 50 years of women. The 50th anniversary of women is enrolling as undergraduates, but also the achievements of the women faculty, staff, students, and alumni since then. You joined the faculty a decade ago. During that time, has your gender affected your experience at the college, and if so, how?
I knew you were going to ask this question, and I was thinking about it a lot. And the answer is sort of a problematic yes and no. Gender always affects professors, no matter where they are. I don't know if you know this, but when you're on the market, when you're trying to get a job as a professor, they tell you to take your wedding ring off. They tell you I lost my wedding ring. I don't have it anymore. But they tell you, whatever you do, don't mention you have a kid if you have a kid. Like, you're supposed to hide all family affiliations. And guys get the opposite advice. They're like, oh, if you have a family, make sure you talk them up. Because the idea apparently is that men with a family will want stability and won't leave. But women with a family, well, they'll need more time off. Or they'll have other obligations. It's a really problematic thing. It's not just PC. But when I came to PC for my interview, I decided, I don't care. I'm bringing up my kid and my husband, and if they have a problem with that, I know I don't want to work here. And I did. And no, everybody was great. In fact, I think two of the faculty members in my department were pregnant at the time. So it told me very positive things about PC. On the other hand, especially when I started, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's because you're new or if it's because you're a woman that you might be having some issues. It's difficult to say, but, initially, and this doesn't really happen anymore. I haven't heard it happening to people. But I came in, right around the time I came in, PC was in the middle of a huge amount of hiring. And so there was a lot of untenured women in the feeder departments for Civ, like in English and history. And we all kind of had stories like this, they weren't meant to be offensive, but they kind of were. Like, I remember I had one Civ teammate introduce me to the class as, well, this little lady's going to give you a lecture. And I'm like, what? Dude, it's like, can you imagine if I had said, this little man is going to give you a lecture, this sort of thing. So it's a lot of, and I think it spoke to, this is not a PC cultural thing, but a larger academic cultural thing, especially, academics in the 60s and 70s. It was hard for women to get into graduate school. It was hard for women to get the same sort of respect as their male colleagues. And so a lot of my current male colleagues who are, a lot older than me, they went to college at a time when it was sort of very male-dominated. So I think that their language or perspective, while not meaning to be offensive, can sometimes sort of reflect that. But in general, I've not had huge issues. Sometimes students are a little confused. I remember when my first semester, I taught with, Sandra Keating and Raymond Hain, two wonderful professors. And Raymond was in his first year of Civ, like me as well. And Sandra's, she's been here a little longer and she's very experienced. And we got an email addressed to the three of us from a student. And it said, "Dear Dr. Hain, Mrs. Keating, and Miss Greene." And you're like, kiddo. So there's I think there's a lot of students who grow up in perhaps more small c conservative households where there's more of a patriarchal perspective. And they're kind of shocked. No, I was like, I had another student I was teaching with, Tim Mahoney and Terry McGoldrick my second year, and they're great. But they both look very professorial. They sort of fit that stereotype. And I gave the first lecture, and this girl came up to me afterwards, and she was just so excited. And and she said to me, "It is so cool that you get to teach with real professors." And then she said, what is your job? And I was like, I'm a professor. She's like, no, your day job. And so I told her I solved Greek and Latin emergencies for the government. And I think she believed me. But so she's like, you get to teach with professors. You're so lucky. And I'm thinking, this is like 2012, honey. And so, so we are, I think, more often than we expect, new for students, not so much new for faculty.
It is amazing how much of these sort of micro aggressions, to use perhaps the wrong word, but like you've experienced from students.
It is. And again, they're all well-meaning. And it just speaks to their background being very different than the one I typically expect of students. So in a way, it helps me be a better teacher because I have to keep reminding myself, first of all, that not everybody comes from the same sort of background as me. And second of all, that I might actually be their first female professor. And you realize that's kind of a responsibility. And I probably screw it up. But, it makes me think about these things. And I might not have otherwise.
Dr. Greene, it has been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Liz.
Subscribe to the Providence College Podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, as well as your smart speaker. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.